temperature in the mid-70s. It was by far the most comfortable and beautiful day of the summer, and a great day for the guys to be all dressed up in pads and to start actually doing at least a little bit of contact.
Yeah, and Joe Judge spoke about whether or not this was a major milestone, whether or not this is something to pretty much bring down compared to the narratives that we're seeing thrown out across the NFL landscape. And I think he did a good job when he spoke to the media putting things in perspective. Meaning, Paul, we can't get too carried away in terms of the initial observations because this is really the first time that guys are getting physical with one another. Unfortunately, we've already seen some injuries across the league, so you want to be careful in terms of how hard you push the players. But football's not football without the physicality, and I think like anything else, this is just the next step in the gradual process as we get set for week 1.
Well, you mentioned a gradual process. The bottom line is on Friday there will be a intra-squad scrimmage. That one's not going to be probably as tough or as physical as the ensuing weeks when Judge continues to do those on a weekly basis. But I do believe that's going to be the culmination of the ramp up that we are seeing this week as they finally started to get the pads on. And then week after week after week until we get to September 14th and that opener against the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Giants will just gradually try to get to that point. Look, Joe Judge was very, very careful to tell these guys, we understand that you don't want to get guys hurt. You don't want to have things rushed because that's the way to make mistakes. They want to take everything step by step, pay attention to detail, lay the foundation, and at the same time make sure guys are physically ramping up their bodies to where they're going to be ready for that first game.
Well, and that's why, given it's a gradual process, I think some of the biggest takeaways for a padded practice as it gets started with the Joe Judge era is the logistics. And few things that are notable with respect to the pace, Paul. This is a quick 90-minute practice. Joe Judge really likes to try to cram in as much as possible, keep the guys moving, maximize the reps. Players are not wearing jerseys on. They are wearing jerseys, not wearing the names on the back of their jerseys. And his interesting observation when he was asked about that was he wants the players to get to know each other's movements without necessarily having to identify one another. And, that was interesting. We'll hear from Saquon Barkley on that in a little bit. But, these are at least some of the initial observations of how a Joe Judge practice is organized, structured, and so forth.
Well, there's one other very obvious thing about a Joe Judge practice. He does not like mistakes on the field because when you make a mistake like jumping off sides, you pay a penalty by having to run a lap after practice. And in fact, he had everybody running a lap after practice today because he said he didn't like the mistakes and you've got to pay a price for it. And quite honestly, Sterling Shepard himself said, I understand that. Even though that's a high school and college trick, you usually don't see that in the National Football League. Shepard said, well, if you don't want to run the laps after practice, then don't make any mistakes.
So those are some of the notable logistics, the layout of the land in terms of the first padded practice. Now, Joe Judge was asked about, well, now that you're graduating to padded practices and you've seen the guys a little bit on the field during OTAS type of practices, how would you assess the state of the team as they begin the third phase of training camp? This is what he had to say.
Yeah, look, at this point, it's all day by day. Today was our first day in pads. You get used to the tempo of being in shells for a couple days. You throw on the pads, the intensity rises up naturally a little bit. The physicality rises up today. We weren't going live, tackling to the ground or anything today, but that'll be added as we go. The biggest thing is to make sure the technique and execution doesn't break down just because the pads go on. And I think, initially the guys have to get used to the tempo and the physicality of the plays. I expect our next practice to be cleaner and better executionally than today, but we expect that no matter what they're in. If it's just helmet shells or it's full pads, we always expect a marked improvement every day.
And I'm not surprised to hear Joe Judge, Paul, by the way, focus on the fundamentals because if you go back to his introductory presser, remember, he's got a teaching background. So the minute details, the very small things, the nuances of the game is something he's always been preaching. So you could tell, even though they're now putting the pads on, the emphasis is still on those little small details that he's obviously keeping close tabs on.
You know what I've noticed a little bit here over now, it's 3 practices I've been to. The thing that I've noticed is that these assistant coaches are very quick not just to explain something to a guy when he may do it wrong. They will run right out there next to him and they'll physically show him, especially Mark Colombo. Oh, my goodness. As soon as he sees something, he's hopping on his motorcycle. He's getting right up to that line of scrimmage. He's right in the middle of those linemen, and he's tapping them and saying, hey, look, this is what we're going to do. And he's physically showing him. At one point today, I thought he was probably the fastest moving guy on the field. I mean, that's how energized he was and so anxious to get over the ball and show a technique that he wanted these guys to learn. So, and I'm seeing that in the other positions too, but he's the one who's the most demonstrative about it. And I think this goes back to the whole thing about the primary goal of these coaches is to teach. It's a teaching staff. It's not an instruction staff. It's a teaching staff. And you don't see enough of that, I think, in today's NFL.
Well, when we spoke to some of the assistants last week, Sean Spencer preached that. He said that's where he comes from in terms of his Penn State days. He's very interactive. He's very energized. He'll run with guys. And also, Tyke Tolbert, I think, belongs in this conversation. Because remember, the one thing that was notable about Tyke, and he's obviously still doing this, Tyke Tolbert during practice last year, what he made very well known is every time a wide receiver would run a route and catch a pass, he would run down the sideline, Paul, with them. That was just the theme that he was practicing and preaching on a daily basis. So, once again, I just think Colombo is sort of an extension of that, because even Spencer was talking about this last week where he said, I'm going to run with guys on the field to make sure they finish the play so that we're preaching the fundamentals once again. So I think that while Colombo may be a little bit more in-your-face type of guy, which is not a surprise, he's a former offensive lineman, we saw a little bit of that, at least through Tyke Tolbert last season.
Well, I think that Coach Tolbert is just trying to outdo my 5 miles that I do every morning. That's what I think. I don't know if he's got a counter on his wrist or not, but, he certainly gets his step count in for sure.
My money is with Tyke Tolbert, no offense to you, Paul. I'd say he has the slight edge just being around the NFL in terms of running and in motion with all the wide receivers that he's coached.
Some of those routes are pretty long.
They are, but I would say he's built up enough durability over the course of his career. I'd give him the slight edge. But we may have to have a race when, of course, the country returns to normalcy between you and Tyke Tolbert, because those are some fighting words I heard out of you, a little bit challenging. It sounds like you're a little bit annoyed that somebody's creeping into your territory.
Oh,
I don't know.
My goodness. It'll be an interesting match. Let's just say that.
Well, Saquon Barkley also spoke to the media, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with respect to not having jersey names on the back of your jersey. And Barkley was posed the question about, from the running back's lens, does he understand Joe Judge's mindset that the focus should be on watching your opponent's rhythm and motion as opposed to the number? This is what Barkley had to say on that.
I would say it definitely makes sense. I see where you're coming from, because a lot of times you're just reacting. But whether it's just watching film, you can see how those guys pop up on film, whether it's an older guy like Martinez or a younger guy like Darnell, you can see the things that they're able to do, and it's forcing you to watch them on film and the way that they react. So when you go into the season, that can carry over, but also just forcing you to get to know your teammates, and forcing you to go out there and get to know your teammates, not just everyone, not just who only focus on the offensive side, but everyone who plays a role in special teams, everyone who plays a role in defense, and all the young guys coming in. I would say that's where it plays a big role too.
So that goes back into the tendencies of your opposition and the teammates that we were talking about earlier. But one of the things I want to piggyback off of, based on what he was just talking about, he brought up Blake Martinez and he brought up Darnell Holmes. And yes, it's still very early, but I would say Darnell Holmes has jumped out a little bit, Paul, in terms of his aggressiveness, his smarts. They did mention last week when we spoke to the assistants, Jerome Henderson, they were going to work him on the inside and the outside. And even Sterling Shepard mentioned that he's been seeing a lot of Darnell Holmes because Holmes has been lining up on the inside and they've had an opportunity to go one-on-one. And, this is an example of maybe a rookie not trying to be timid in the early goings of padded practices because he understands the clock is ticking before week one.
Darnell Holmes had a nice diving interception inside the back of the end line in the end zone earlier today, got up and started racing down the sideline. I do think he would have had a chance had it been a real game. He might have taken it the other way for a 100-plus yard interception return. It was an impressive play. he has really, in my mind, stood out over the course of these first few practices. I don't think there's any doubt that, again, he's a skill position guy, so you're going to have a better look at him in one-on-one situations when he's going up, against these opponents. So I get that. I would expect him, if he's doing well, to show up a lot easier than some of the other players. He has, and that's a good thing. And from everything the coaches are saying, they're also very impressed with him too. Darnell Holmes could very well be, as a fourth-round draft choice, the starting slot corner on this team and one of the steals of this draft.
No doubt about it. And here's the bottom line. Right now, there's opportunities in the secondary, specifically at the cornerback position. So I'm sure from Darnell Holmes' perspective, he's saying to himself, you got DeAndre Baker on the commissioner's exempt list, Sam Beal opted out, and James Bradbury is the guy on one side. If you're Darnell Holmes, how could you not be thinking about, Paul, hey, I may not have to be that guy waiting my turn in year number one. There's no reason why I can't carve out a starting spot, especially when they're also still looking for that nickel corner and they're trying out guys at corner and safety. So I can't think of a more attractive opportunity, I guess is what I'm saying, for Darnell Holmes to be thinking about right now compared to the rest of the cornerbacks on the roster.
Well, see, just based on size alone, and I also think that Ballantyne has looked pretty good. He's been in good position so far during the practices. Hasn't necessarily made all the plays, but he's been in good position. I like Ballantyne. If Baker doesn't make it back, I like Ballantyne to start opposite Bradbury, and I like Holmes to be the starting slot guy. Now, Grant Haley did not work today. He was on the side doing lightly jogging sprints with the training staff, and when asked after practice, Coach Judge said Haley needed more conditioning. Now, all I can say about that is when the coach says you need more conditioning and you're off on the side doing some jogging and running, that probably indicates that the coach was not necessarily pleased with your work habits. That's just, I'm trying to read into that there because they've been doing conditioning now for the better part of 2 weeks. I'm not sure how a player could suddenly need more conditioning and have to do jogging on the side.
Well, listen, Paul, that there's a distinct difference in terms of being in good conditioned shape, and then you put the pads on, and all of a sudden it's a completely different story.
Well, how is Grant Haley not prepared for this, knowing that there's a job to be won? I just would say I'm a little bit disappointed. If that's all it was, that he needed more conditioning, I'm disappointed that he didn't get his conditioning up to speed.
Well, that's more of a reason why Darnell Holmes is taking full advantage of his opportunity, because he's very observant of the environment around him, and he realizes, hey, if you got one guy sidelined because of conditioning, you have another guy sidelined because of off-the-field issues, and somebody else who opted out, once again, hey, it's for the taking. Let's not hesitate. So I think it's good to see his energy. We know he's a smart player. We know what he was asked to do at UCLA and known to have that aggressive feel. Now it's a matter of him transferring that to the practice field and also knowing that he doesn't have a preseason game. See, this is the thing. If they're going to decide on a rookie, Paul, winning one of the starting jobs, he's going to have to earn it in practice because he has no games to do that. I understand he's going to have an intra-scrimmage game on Fridays, but that's still a very small sample size. So every practice for a rookie is going to be put under the microscope because you have an idea of what the veterans on this team can do. Even if you didn't coach them, you got a good read on them based on what they've done elsewhere. You have some film. You don't have anything of Darnell Holmes on the NFL level. So, once again, it's encouraging to see he understands every single practice is basically a new game for him. And the more games with positive results that he piles up increases his chances to solidify himself as one of the three starting corners.
I would agree.
So that, once again, to me, is something that has jumped off the practice page when it comes to evaluating the defensive side of the ball. Now, Darnell Holmes has been going up against Sterling Shepard, as we mentioned. Well, the narrative surrounding the offense this year is there's a lot of weapons, there's a lot of versatility. All of those guys weren't on the field simultaneously last year. They're hoping to obviously cross that off the list this year. But Shepard was told that many people look at the Giants and they say the Giants don't have a number one wide receiver. Well, Sterling, what's your reaction to that?
I think we're all capable of making plays, and I think that's the only thing that's important when it all boils down is can you trust a guy to make a play? And I think that we have three guys that are able to do that. And then another guy that you forgot to mention is Evan Ingram. he's basically a wide receiver playing tight end position. So I think we have a lot of guys that can make plays. I don't think we're focused on putting a number on any of us.
I always find it interesting when we have the debates about the number one guy versus the number two guy. To me, Paul, and this is once again just my opinion, I'm curious your perspective, the 1-2 conversation to me is much more relevant, I feel, to this fantasy football ideology today in terms of draft value and is a guy going to put up X amount of catches and numbers, more so than it really truly applies to the X's and O's of the NFL. If you have multiple guys that you could spread the wealth with, as long as they're consistently producing and giving the defense something to pay attention to, personally, I don't get too caught up on Golden Tate is 1A and Shepard's 1B or vice versa. You want to have a conversation about Julio Jones and Michael Thomas and who's better to draft? Fine, we can have the conversation about 1 versus 2. As it applies to teams, because we're seeing a lot of teams with a lot of substance, depth, versatility, as long as guys are producing, that to me is the most important aspect.
You know what you just did, Lance? You just created the best argument against fantasy football, because those people need to care about individual players' stats for their own personal gain. As far as coaches or GMs or guys like us who are trying to evaluate a team, it's about the team's success. And it doesn't matter who gets those individual stats, as long as the unit is helping that team to victory on Sunday. And that's exactly the approach that the Giants are taking. I couldn't agree with it more. Again, it's a reason why I detest fantasy football in every way, because people just think players are good based on the numbers that they give them, in their stupid games every weekend.
And listen, I love fantasy football. I'm not going to.
Oh, you do? I thought you were on my page with that.
Well, no, I am. I'm on your page, but I also know how to separate the two. I could say I apply one rationale and logic to fantasy football.
The problem is most people don't, Lance. Most people
course,
just think
it's challenging. It's difficult.
Most people think that the fantasy football numbers actually equate to a player's quality on the field, and it is so far from the truth.
Well, because the lines have been so blurred. And you know what? I'll actually bring up something which is relevant to what I wanted to get to, because if you notice, Shepard also included Evan Ingram's name in that soundbite, because he said, hey, let's not just talk about the receivers, let's talk about the tight end. So I was having a conversation on Sirius XM NFL radio the other day, and we were talking about underrated tight ends. And it actually brought into play what you're talking about, is how some people get caught up in the fantasy element and others get caught up in what they actually do on the field. So, for example, Dawson Knox, who's the Buffalo Bills tight end, Paul, okay? I would consider him an underrated tight end. He only had 28 receptions last season. But you put on the film, and you look at what he does for the Bills offense, and you look at how he helps the blocking scheme, especially up the field, the second layer, which the Giants learned the hard way in their matchup last season. That's a way of saying, hey, he may not be fantasy attractive, but he's very attractive for what he does within the offense. So there's an example of, don't get caught up in just the statistical output. Look at the Giants receivers, Paul. How many times did we talk about last season what the receivers do up the field to block for Saquon, right? And then give him an extra 10 yards. Remember, it was the Washington game, I want to say
Sterling
2 seasons
Shepard
ago, right? And Sterling, we're seeing him hustle up the field to give Saquon an opportunity to turn a 35-yard run into a 50-yard run.
That's right.
How do you compute Sterling's fantasy value with respect to that? Where does that show up?
You can't.
Yeah.
That's why people who talk about players based on their fantasy football numbers are fools. But the problem is we have such a fantasy football rage these days that people think that equates to football knowledge, and it just doesn't.
And that's exactly why I think Sterling Shepard was emphasizing we're not having a competition to see who's going to finish the year 1, 2, 3. It's a matter of, if you want to ask me about the outlook of the Giants offense this season, I think there's a few things you put on your checklist. Number one is, of course, durability, Paul, because the 5 key weapons were not on the field simultaneously once last season, okay? You can't go through another season like that. So all of these guys, they only have so much control over that, of course, but the goal is you want to get multiple games where all 5 are on the field. Number 2, You want to give Daniel Jones a reason to spread the wealth this year and not say that I have to rely on player A or this game I have to rely on player B. Hey, if the defense is opening things up for one player and you got to lean on him, hey, that's just the natural flow of a game. But you want to prove that there's enough balance within this offense. And then the third aspect I would throw in, you want guys like Sterling Shepard, Golden Tate, Darius Slade, and Evan Ingram, when he obviously is asked to do it, to prove that they are very effective in blocking up the field for fellow wide receivers and, of course, Saquon. And if you have all three of those elements in play consistently during the course of the season, then I would say we're not getting caught up in who's 1, 2, or 3 on the depth chart.
The biggest stat, Lance, that is of most importance week in and week out, how many points you score.
Without
And it really does not matter individual statistics. It's about, does your unit effectively allow your offense to put enough points on the board to win the game? That's it.